Hello, world, and welcome to our inaugural podcast episode of Mindfulness Off the Cushion. I'm joined by our three co-hosts, Christina Filburn, Patrick Harris, and Claudio Barrientos. I'd like to jump straight into introductions so our listeners have an idea of who we are, and then we'll roll into unpacking what the title of our episode means, why it's important, and on and on. Christina, can I ask you to get us started?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, Lance. My name is Christina Filburn. I'm a licensed clinical social worker here in the state of Texas. I also am licensed in both New Jersey and New York. Happy to be here collaborating, talking about mindfulness. A little bit of my history is I moved to Texas about 4 years ago. The bulk of my experience professionally and personally in mindfulness has been in New York. I do have a historical position as an adjunct professor at the Steve Hicks School of Social Work in reference to in practice, as well as a instructor at Dell Medical School in regards to interdisciplinary professional education. And I have been in private practice for about 3 or 4 years now. Thank you. Patrick?
My name is Patrick Harris. I'm a licensed professional counselor here in Texas. I split my time between private practice. I'm also an adjunct professor of psychology at Houston Tillotson University. I also practice clinical hypnotherapy and tobacco cessation. Got that training through Rutgers University's anti-smoking campaign. I've spent most of my career doing community-based mental health with more acute populations and recently made the change over to private practice. And now I'm finishing out my time there while working on a PhD in mind-body medicine with an emphasis in integrated mental health. So what about you, Claudio? Let me pass the talking stick over to you.
I appreciate that. Okay, Patrick. My name is Claudio Barrientos. I am a graduate student right now at University of Texas, San Antonio, getting my master's in social work with a specialization in clinical approaches to social work. I guess the mindfulness seed was planted back in 1999 when I took my very first course in mindfulness at Presbyterian Hospital in Albuquerque, New Mexico. That course was taught by James Duvall, who comes from the Jon Kabat-Zinn School of Mindfulness. About 11 years later, I moved to Albuquerque, New Mexico, and became immersed in a 2.5-year teacher training program through the Mindful Center. James Duvall and Michelle Duvall, the daughter of James Duvall, were my instructors during those 2.5 years. And after that, I moved to Knoxville, Tennessee, and launched the Mindful Center Knoxville, where I taught MBSR, where I also went into the various workplaces and taught mindfulness there, and worked also a lot with adolescents. So about 3 years ago, I moved to Texas, and I decided that it was time for me to couple my mindfulness background with a clinical understanding of mindfulness and a clinical approach to mindfulness. And that's why I decided to go to grad school. So I'm graduating next May. So I'm super excited for that too.
Awesome. Very cool. I'm excited for you as well. And thank you, all three of you, for taking the time to be here. All of our time is precious. And so I certainly appreciate it. So for me personally, I'm probably the least qualified to be on this podcast, to be honest. I'm a self-proclaimed mindfulness student. As the co-owner of the Austin Mindfulness Center, I've been familiar with mindfulness and witnessed my wife's own discovery and embracing of mindfulness over the last 4 to 5 years, but have only recently begun studying it more with more intention and purpose. And as of last week, I'm now a graduate of an MBSR program. And so for those of you who don't know, MBSR is mindfulness-based stress reduction, which was founded many years ago. In fact, we could say many decades ago now by Jon Kabat-Zinn. Jon Kabat-Zinn, for everyone's benefit, is, I guess, internationally renowned for his work as a scientist, a writer, a meditation teacher, and has really been engaged in the process of bringing mindfulness into the mainstream of medicine and society in the Western world. I think that's a pretty fair description of JKZ. And just to wrap up my own experience. So over the last 3-4 months going through this MBSR program, I've developed a formal daily meditation practice, which we're going to explain a little bit more in this episode. And I've honestly, candidly, genuinely experienced a notable, softening of my own character and, or being, if you will, and an improved ability to roll with the bumps in the road without getting set off. So, having said that, the $10,000 question is, does the world need yet another podcast? What the heck are we doing here? And are we really going to provide enough content or enough interesting, useful content to the world at large to really be of value? Anyone want to take a stab at that?
I would say it's a good time, like a lot of other people during COVID, to present a podcast, not because we are bored and just feel like doing something else and be task oriented, but instead be able to be practical about sharing some really helpful skills that are not only useful off the cushion, but without a pandemic, but also I think, especially during a pandemic, I think now more than ever, MBSR or mindfulness-based stress reduction or mindfulness in general has been a really nice asset to help us with any sort of existential question, or what are we doing here, or how are we feeling about these things, and how are we being? So I think what our podcast can provide, that in addition to the podcasts that already exist, are our individual experiences, our connectedness to mindfulness, and our individual perspectives, molding it together to make a sort of mindfulness cocktail or mindfulness soup that could be presented in a different way. That could be helpful to additional audiences?
The short answer is yes, there is a place for this podcast in the ecosystem of podcasts out there. I think there's also a place for this talk of mindfulness in the vast industry that mindfulness has become in the last 10, 20, 30 years. I think the most important thing that we can do as individuals, and I have to say that I've relatively new to all three of you, but one thing that I sense is an authentic desire to express ourselves and to express what mindfulness is and what it means to us, and how we can use this skill, modality, state of mind, whatever you want to call it, to help people. So as long as that's the mission, as long as that's the essence of what we're trying to do, then yes, there is a place for us here. And I want to keep it as engaging and fun as possible, because there is a lot of laughs to be had with mindfulness.
I would say yes, in addition to my constant need of attention and just needing another platform to have people listen to the sound of my voice. I think where some podcasts, especially on mindfulness specifically, go wrong is that there's no diversity in either the hosts or the guests. A lot of them come from the same schools of thought or come from the same trainings or have read the same books. And there's not a lot of organic conversation that comes out of that. It's just reaffirming things that everybody on that podcast already knows. So here we have somebody that's a student and somebody that has been trained independently. And even though we have two therapists, we have two different therapists. We're both therapists by trade, but I'm an LPC and Christina's a LCSW, right? A social work background. So even though we're both providing psychotherapy, it's different trainings, different educational backgrounds, different understanding of the field, which is also going to blend into our uses of mindfulness, both clinically and personally. And this creates an interesting opportunity to look at a problem from several different angles.
And to piggyback off that, one common denominator is that we all practice mindfulness personally. So outside of our professional experiences and professional applicability to these topics, we are all also individual practitioners. So I think that that also can be very welcoming to all practitioners of all walks of life for mindfulness.
I'd like to take it back to something that Claudio said, something that there's room for laughter, or a role for laughter when it comes to mindfulness. And that takes me back to a podcast episode with Dan Harris, 10% Happier, when he was interviewing John Kabat-Zinn. And he said, this is very serious stuff here. I mean, you could argue this is life and death stuff. And so when you're in that type of space, in this type of circumstance where you're dealing with life and death stuff, humor has a role. Humor is very important. So something to keep in mind. And I'm this type of individual where I have to crack a joke every now and then. I have to keep it light. I do love to get serious, but if I can do both at the same time, then all the better. So having said that, I'm going to ask you guys, why will anyone ever listen to this? I mean, are we in fact experty enough? I know none of you want to be called experts. Is merely skillful good enough for the common day podcast listener?
Well, my take on this, right? If we look up the very rigid, definition of expert, it's sort of like an authority. Obviously, in the spirit of mindfulness and the spirit of psychotherapy, or just in the world in general, even if we're not psychotherapists, it's really nice to create a world that is more comfortable and maybe softer when we take out a sort of superiority versus inferiority complex in regards to who is an expert or who is not. Of course, one could say, I am an expert because I have practiced X amount of hours, and that's okay. And some people like to hear that, and I think it's helpful. And then there's the other part of it of where I want to loosely say that me, myself, I can say I identify as a lifelong learner, right? Learning is like this conveyor belt, and it continues to move. And in regards to lifelong learners, for individuals who are unfamiliar with that term, it's the idea that I may or may not be a quote unquote expert. And even still, I keep acquiring new skills and capabilities, and I keep questioning or probing and optimizing any ideas I've had of mindfulness through my individual practice, through my practice with clients, and in the world in general.
In the field of psychotherapy, I think that there is a place to be called an expert. I think that the licensure and the process that that both of you have gone through, and that I'm going through right now, saying there is something to that right there. There's a certain statement of dedication and purpose and drive, and also you have to be able to pass licensure exams. There's a whole ethical component to providing psychotherapy services that one has to be very cognizant and very responsible about. I think that when it comes to that, you need, and people, I think that you need that expert label on you. The beautiful thing about the practice of mindfulness is that perhaps that doesn't need it. And I think that that's my schooling. The most intelligent people that have been able to express this practice, this very rich practice, this very poignant practice, are people that do not take themselves seriously about the practice, meaning they have great depth, great knowledge, but they also understand that it is not about a label. So that we transcend that, and that the practice transcends that. That's really poignant, I think.
Yeah, and that label will give people something to strive for, which kind of goes against the whole intention of mindfulness, right? I'm going to paraphrase and probably butcher it, but there's kind of like a Zen parable of a student talks to a master and asks, how long would it take me to become a Zen master? And they say something around like 10 years. And they're like, no. What if I like meditate like really hardcore, like 10 hours a day? And they're like, oh, okay, then 15 years. No. What if I meditate like from morning till night? Okay, 20 years. Because if we're just like only have our eye on that prize, like if we're only entering this field or this study, or not even mindfulness, just anything in general with the intention of becoming an expert or dominating it or becoming the best, then you're already at a disadvantage, because you're doing something, one, that you'll never attain, and two, you're going into it for the wrong reasons. It's about the journey, not the destination. So if you're going to consider yourself an expert, you're going to be missing out on pertinent information or pertinent experience that would actually make you an expert. But I like that we keep bringing up humor. I'm incredibly biased about humor in mindfulness and therapy because one, it is a perfect reframe tool. Like if we're looking at CBT or even mindfulness of looking at things from a different perspective, whether we're using gallows and dark humor or positive affiliative humor, we're taking something and we're looking at it from a different perspective to bring us joy. And essentially that's kind of what mindfulness is being able to look at a situation from different sides and different perspectives. Again, I'm biased. I'm on the board of directors for the Association for Applied Therapeutic Humor, and I've been trained in humanitarian clowning by Patch Adams. So humor is definitely my worldview, but I've seen it work in suicidal patients in psychiatric hospitals. I've seen it work in private practices. I've seen it work all across the board, academic settings, because we know that humor helps retain information and stores it better in the long-term memory, and definitely helps you connect with either a person or a subject or even a situation. And that's really at the root of what mindfulness is.
So, Lance, when you ask, is there a need for another podcast? Just listen to what Patrick and his background, listen to Christina and her background, listen to each of our individual backgrounds. I think that we're bringing something pretty unique here. I think I'm saying Patrick's background with Dr. Patch Adams, that is awesome, right? And I think that we're going to have, I think maybe that's going to be a title for one of the podcasts is, there we go, mindfulness and the introduction of humor and the role of humor in that. So I am privileged and happy and very excited about this.
I do want to add to that as well, piggybacking off of what Patrick was saying before about the finish line being an expert. I think the objective nature of being curious is also a large foundational part of mindfulness, and curiosity has no limits. And so continuously being curious is the mindful approach that I think is best in order to keep reaching higher and higher, lower and lower, side to side, no spatial awareness there. The other piece of it, I guess, for some listeners that would listen to humor, I'm obviously a huge fan of humor. We do have to kind of go to, I guess, when we speak about mindfulness-based cognitive behavioral therapy, in that it sometimes can be used in practical settings as a defense mechanism. I'm not saying it's being used here, but we do know that that can be a way to sort of avoid harder emotions or feelings. I still think that's okay to label it as such. And I think, Patrick is still being mindful of knowing those defense mechanisms, in addition to using that research to know the benefits of humor, but just wanting to point out the, sorry to be the negative Nancy, sorry for all the Nancys out there, the sort of ego defense of bringing humor in sometimes inappropriately or at some times when it is not wanted. And I guess I would like to say, I'm going to make a little bit of a judgment working in New York. My experience with New York, humor was not as welcomed, both for me individually, professionally, and personally. Earlier on in my career, I would think I may have used humor. If I used it inappropriately, is because I may have not been as mindful at the time and felt uncomfortable about a very serious topic, as well as being able to identify when individuals you're working with or talking to are doing the same. So all that to say, I think that there is a great place for humor, and to be mindful about humor is also an excellent thing to be aware of.
So let's take a moment to unpack the name of the podcast, Mindfulness Off the Cushion. I'm going to throw the talking stick, as Patrick says, over to you guys. I want to know what that term means to you and why it's so important. But before I do, I just wanted to mention, I'm going to mention the 10% podcast, 10% Happier podcast one more time. But the most recent episode, I can't tell you the number, but Dan Harris was interviewing Shayla Catherine. And in fact, he used the term off the cushion. So I know it's not a term that we're making up. I just thought it was kind of timely that my perspective of Dan Harris and the 10% Happier podcast is really more about meditation and not necessarily always that focused on the daily walk with mindfulness, living that mindful life throughout the day. So I think that we would very much be complementary to the 10% Happier podcast, but I thought it was kind of cool that he used that term, off the cushion. I'd like to maybe go around the room and see if anyone has their take on the importance of off the cushion.
Well, I do want to add that just according to the research, like in 2015, Sharon Salzberg actually spoke about mindfulness off the cushion on February 11th, 2015. So we do know it's a thing and that it's very much applicable. And based on that, I wanted to, it's interesting that you clarified for me, because when I was, as the clinician that I am, I thought off the cushion actually was referring to practicing with clients and individuals and them sitting on a cushion versus a meditation practice off of the cushion. So it seems like there can be some playful ambiguity in the title. And I think that leaves space for people to apply what off the cushion means to them. And therefore, I think that would be, it's a great way to kind of diversify what that means to others. Me personally, it's almost as if I am in that same metaphor. It's as almost if I am trying to bring the cushion with me everywhere, whether I'm practicing with clients or I'm doing my individual meditation practice. Obviously, that always doesn't work. But I would say in that sort of same frame of reference of always wanting to be on the cushion, but maybe practicing off the cushion.
So I'll jump in just for the sake of clarity, in case any of our listeners are like asking themselves, what the heck is it with this cushion? What are they talking about? And so the initial idea behind that word, it is a meditation cushion. The idea that you're sitting down and you have a formal practice, theoretically every day, perhaps more than once a day, to sit down if that's what's comfortable to you, sit down on a cushion if that's what's comfortable to you, close your eyes if you're comfortable with that, and meditate for 15, 35 minutes. That is what we call a formal meditation practice. I love your take on that, Christina, where you're thinking, well, isn't that the clinician's cushion? Isn't that the couch cushion? So I'm interested in your take on that, Patrick. What do you think?
Well, my biggest thing, whether I'm providing mindfulness training like an education setting or in a therapeutic setting, it's making it more specific and catered to the individual, because books and podcasts and blogs and all of this do a really good job of like the what and the why of mindfulness, but there's not always a good how. Like they will say it could be meditation, it could be this, and very specific, rigid interventions. But when we look at the difference between like accommodation and assimilation of new information, so you can accommodate new information and force something that's new and novel and maybe a little uncomfortable and not your jam into your life because you feel that that's what you need and that's the only way to practice mindfulness. Or you can take that information and assimilate it into stuff that's already there to make it more useful and more building off of existing functional strengths rather than reinventing the wheel. So instead of going out and buying your own cushion and meditating in your own home, what are you already doing that you can expand upon? Is it gardening? Is it my new thing is because I've gone on this like nostalgia rabbit hole of watching Cobra Kai and it's bringing back all of the original Karate Kid feels. I bought a bonsai tree. And that is my new mindfulness jam, because you have to sit there and prune individually and look for like little new sprouts and water it and do all this stuff. So that's my newest form of meditation. I'm still meditating in the traditional sense, but that's something that I'm also building off of and assimilating too. I also, again, going back to like the diversity of this panel, is that we're all going to have a different approach of that. Like, what does the how look like? And the how for me is going to look different than the how for you and the how for Claudio and the how for Christina. And so when we talk about diversity, it makes me think of a common interview question that interviewers will ask is, where do you keep the ketchup? Are y'all familiar with this question? It's depending on like what part of the country or what part of the world you are. Different people keep ketchup in the refrigerator. People might keep ketchup in the pantry. And the reason why that's such a profound question is because it's what we do with that information. So if you have a hot dog and you keep your ketchup in the refrigerator and you're out of ketchup, what are the condiments that are going to be next to it that could replace it? You could go mustard, you could go mayonnaise, you can go relish, other things that we also keep in the refrigerator. But if we keep it in the pantry, what are we going to go? We're going to look at vinegar. We're going to look at seasonings. We're going to look at other opportunities that aren't necessarily going to be the same as for people that keep the ketchup in the refrigerator. So we're bringing in this diverse perspective on the same topic based on our own understanding and practices. And so that to me is going to be key when we're talking about off the cushion of how do we bring mindfulness into practical applications and not completely disrupting your existing way of life.
My piggyback off of where do we keep the ketchup is for our Eastern civilization folks. I don't know about y'all's traveling, but in Asia, and actually where my family's from in Italy, they don't use ketchup at all. So I wanted to just point out the mindfulness around, at times I'm guilty of this too, this sort of like, I don't want to say ethnocentrism of what we know to exist in our realities and how other people relate to our realities. Because like I said, some countries don't use ketchup at all, but I didn't mean to undermine what you were saying. Just to say that some people don't use ketchup at all. And I think that's okay too.
Cobra Kai is an awesome show. I actually started watching that show years ago when it first premiered on the YouTube Red channel. So I caught that first season and it was one of those guilty pleasures for me where I'm like, I cannot believe that I am enjoying this series so much. And I just went out and told all my friends about it. So there's that information about Cobra Kai. So 99% off the cushion, what it means to me. It kind of symbolizes what you're doing 99% of the time when you're not formally meditating. So for me, off the cushion means is like, how are you interacting with your day-to-day moments with as much consciousness or awareness as possible? I think that there is a opportunity for all of us as instructors, teachers, psychotherapists to be able to make mindfulness accessible to everyone or to each individual in their own respective way. But at the same time, one thing that I have found is that I tend to, my off the cushion life tends to be informed by my on the cushion life. So there is a connection there, a coupling that takes place there, where if I find myself being on the cushion and meditating more frequently or for longer durations of times, it becomes easier for my off the cushion meditation or mindfulness life to be influenced or informed. So there's an interesting connection between the two. I think that it is possible 100% to dedicate much of your mindfulness practice off the cushion. And I think that there's a lot of validity to that. But I also feel that it's been around for 2,500 years for a reason, and there's nothing broken with it. And I think that there is a lot to be gained from sitting and knowing that you're sitting. So that's, and as an instructor, I find that there's going to be some people that gravitate, that want just the off the cushion experience. And that's beautiful. There's going to be some people that understand how the on the cushion experience feeds into the off the cushion experience. And that's beautiful too. There's also some people that just want the on the cushion experience and that they use that as an escape from the everyday life. So it's interesting to see just how diverse the applications can be in that realm. And I think that's perhaps why the title is kind of cool, because it can mean a lot of stuff for different people, as we all have seen.
And I believe it's safe to say that we're not purporting to say that there's one and only one right way to do it, or that if you don't have a formal meditation practice, you're doing it wrong. Or if you mess up like we all do throughout the day and you find that you're not living mindfully, then we're not trying to say that you're doing it wrong. So let's end with this. We need to wrap up our first episode of Mindfulness Off the Cushion. I'd like to pass the talking stick to each of you and ask you for a takeaway, if someone is learning mindfulness, if someone is looking to deepen their mindfulness or meditation experience, what would be one takeaway that they can take with them from this first episode?
I think the theme of today has definitely been approach with an open mind. So if you're listening to this podcast because you just heard about mindfulness, or you want to learn more about mindfulness, or you want to squeeze a little bit more out of your current mindfulness practice, then coming into this with an open mind to hearing the different perspectives and the different experiences and seeing what resonates with you rather than being so focused on taking something away. Allow it to come to you. Kind of like when you're furnishing your home. You don't want to go out and just buy a bunch of stuff just to put on the walls. You want to be patient and wait for things to speak to you, because then it's going to feel much more like a home. It's going to feel much more intentional.
I would say, in the spirit of today's conversation, keep it simple, keep it light, keep it fun.
And I would say, in the spirit of our topic, that we don't necessarily need to be an expert to be mindful or practice mindfulness. I don't think there are any specific qualifications to be a mindfulness practitioner, whether that's professionally or personally. And the other piece is to practice remaining curious and practice being deliberate.
I'll share one thing that I did just this last week. I'm a huge fan of Jon Kabat-Zinn, and in his book, Full Catastrophe Living, he originally laid out some foundational attitudes of mindfulness. And in the book, it was 7. He later added a couple of more. Now we're up to 9. And I love them because they are driven, by these attitudes that one could or should. You want to be careful you're not shoulding all over yourself, but to think of these attitudes throughout the day and adopt them and integrate them into our daily activities. But it's hard to remember 9 of them. So I rewrote them into a mantra, or a couple of mantras, if you will. And it is this, if I may share. This is something I've been saying to myself throughout the day, which is, in this present moment, be curious, generous, and grateful, and patiently practice non-judgment and acceptance. Trust yourself, let go, and just be. And that sort of incorporates all 9 of his mindfulness attitudes. It's not simple because you have to memorize it, but it works for me. And that's the beauty of this. We all have our own way of engaging and integrating mindfulness into our lives. So thank you all for coming, and we'll see you next week.